I still remember the sound of rain tapping against the church windows that morning. It was steady, almost gentle, but to me, it felt like the sky was crying for us. The air inside the church was thick with the scent of polished wood and fading flowers, and somewhere in the back, a baby whimpered before being hushed. I sat in the front row, my hands clasped so tightly they hurt, my head lowered so I wouldn't have to meet anyone's eyes. Across the aisle, people shifted in their seats, whispering softly, their faces lined with sympathy I didn't want. I wasn't ready for their comfort. I wasn't ready for anything. My wife, my best friend for nearly 20 years, lay in a closed casket only a few feet away. The woman who had laughed at my bad jokes, who had danced barefoot in the kitchen on rainy nights, who had been my anchor through storms I didn't think I could survive, gone. Every second I sat there, the reality of it pressed down heavier. It's strange how your mind wanders in moments like that. I should have been listening, but instead I kept seeing flashes of her, the way her hair fell into her face when she read in bed, the way she'd squeeze my hand twice, our little code for I love you, whenever we crossed the street. Those small details haunted me more than the big memories. I think it's because I knew I'd never have them again. Then the pastor stepped forward. He was a tall man with a calm, steady voice that somehow carried over the muffled sobs and occasional coughs. He spoke about faith, about love, about the way my wife had lived her life, the kindness she had shown to everyone she met, the way she somehow made people feel lighter just by being in the room. I listened, but it was like my mind was wrapped in thick fog. Every word floated in and out without meaning, until he looked straight at me. "You're not alone," he said. Just that. 3 words. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt absurd. Of course I was alone. The one person who knew me better than anyone else was gone. People could gather around me all they wanted, but at the end of the day, when the last guest went home and the house felt quiet, who would be there? No one. The rain outside grew heavier, rattling against the stained glass windows. I lowered my eyes, willing the moment to pass, when something happened. I felt a small hand slide into mine. It was my daughter. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. Her fingers curled around mine like she was holding on for dear life. In that instant, I realized, maybe the pastor was right. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. Something shifted in me then. It wasn't a sudden burst of hope or a miraculous healing of grief. It was quieter than that, like the faintest crack of light in a locked room. I still didn't know how I was going to live without my wife. But I knew I couldn't collapse completely, not while my daughter's hand was in mine. That was the moment everything began to change for me. But before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand how we got here, because this wasn't just the story of one day. It was the story of a lifetime built together, of the moments that defined us, and of the loss that threatened to shatter everything, until one simple gesture started to put the pieces back together. Before the church, before the rain, before the pastor's voice filled the air, there was us. We met in the most unremarkable way imaginable, at the grocery store. She was in the baking aisle, comparing brands of vanilla extract like it was a life or death decision. I didn't even like baking, but I stood there far longer than I needed to, pretending to read the label on a bag of flour just to hear her laugh when she realized I was clearly lost. That laugh stayed with me. A week later, we had coffee. By the end of the month, we had our first real argument about whether pineapple belonged on pizza, and somehow, even that felt like a milestone. We learned quickly that love wasn't always about agreeing, it was about respecting each other enough to disagree and still want to share dessert afterward. Our life together was built not on grand gestures, but on 1,000 little moments. Saturday morning pancakes. The way she'd sing off-key in the shower. Movie nights where she always fell asleep halfway through but refused to admit it. She was the kind of woman who noticed when the barista spelled your name wrong and somehow turned it into a running joke for months. We had a daughter 2 years after getting married. I remember the first time she placed our baby girl in my arms. She was exhausted, pale, her hair stuck to her forehead, and she had never looked more beautiful. I thought that was the happiest moment of my life. I was wrong. The happiest moment wasn't a single day, it was the years that followed, watching her be a mother. She was the kind of mom who remembered every little thing, which stuffed animal our daughter needed to sleep, the exact way she liked her sandwiches cut, the song she wanted before bed. She made the mundane magical, turning rainy afternoons into blanket forts and grocery runs into treasure hunts for secret snacks. She had patience I envied, even on days when she was running on almost no sleep. But life doesn't send warnings. One evening, she came home from work quieter than usual. She said she felt tired, like maybe she was coming down with the flu. Over the next few weeks, that tiredness never left. The doctor visits started. First it was let's run some tests. Then it was let's schedule more scans. The word cancer came into our lives like a thief, stealing the air from the room. At first, we fought it with everything we had. Treatments, medications, hopeful conversations about the future. We told our daughter, who was too young to fully understand, that mommy was fighting a bad bug. We smiled in front of her and cried in the bathroom at night. There were good days. Days when she had the strength to take walks with us, days when she'd make pancakes just to prove she still could. On those days, hope didn't feel so far away. But the bad days became more frequent. The energy she once had started slipping away, replaced by a constant, bone-deep exhaustion. One afternoon, I found her sitting on the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinets, tears streaming down her face because she couldn't open a jar of pasta sauce. I took it from her, twisted the lid off easily, and handed it back. She laughed through her tears, saying, "Guess you'll be opening jars for the rest of your life." I didn't know how much those words would come to mean. Then came the appointments where the doctors' voices got softer, more cautious. Words like managing symptoms and making her comfortable replaced recovery and progress. That was when I started bargaining with God, with fate, with anything that might listen. I would have traded every good day I'd ever had for just one more year with her. In the last week, she was in the hospital more than at home. The sterile smell of disinfectant clung to my clothes. I sat by her bed, holding her hand, listening to the hum of machines. She told me to be strong for our daughter. She told me not to let grief turn me into someone I wasn't. And then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, she said, "Promise me you'll remember you're not alone." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. Not fully. On her last night, the moonlight spilled through the blinds, casting pale stripes across her face. I traced my fingers over her knuckles, memorizing every line, every curve, every detail. She whispered, "I love you," and I felt her hand relax in mine. The night she passed away, the house felt like a shell. Every corner carried her. The kitchen still smelled faintly like the cinnamon rolls she had made the weekend before. Her coat still hung by the door. Her mug sat in the sink, waiting to be washed. The days leading to the funeral were a blur, calls to family, choosing flowers, finding a suit that didn't feel like a costume. My daughter kept close to me, quiet but watchful, as if she knew the world had shifted and nothing was safe anymore. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. And then came the morning of the funeral, the day when a pastor would look me in the eyes and tell me something I wasn't ready to hear, but needed more than I knew. The morning of the funeral began before sunrise, when the world was still a dim blur outside the bedroom window. I woke to the hush that follows a night of hard rain, the streets washed clean and the sky the color of wet slate. I sat at the edge of the bed in the clothes I had ironed the night before, staring at the crease in my trousers as though neat lines could hold me together. In the mirror, my face looked older, not because of time, but because grief redraws you without asking permission. My daughter padded into the room in her socks, clutching the frayed rabbit she had slept with since she was 3. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't try to make it better. She simply pressed her shoulder to my arm and leaned, a quiet weight that kept me from drifting. "Are we late?" she asked after a moment. I shook my head. "No. We're just early." The drive to the church felt both too short and too long. Traffic lights changed in slow motion. Street signs blurred past like names I used to know. Outside, The rain had softened to a mist that hung over the pavement, catching the headlights and turning them into halos. When we pulled into the lot, I sat for a breath before cutting the engine. My daughter reached for my hand, squeezed twice, our old code she had borrowed from her mother. I swallowed hard and squeezed back. Inside, the church was already breathing with people, a low tide of voices, the shuffle of coats, the rustle of programs. The floral arrangements formed quiet islands, lilies, roses, eucalyptus, fragrance layered on top of the faint scent of candle wax and old wood. I nodded to faces that floated by, neighbors, coworkers, her students, the woman from the coffee shop who always knew her order. I hadn't realized how many lives she had touched until I saw them gathered in one place, all carrying their own pieces of her. The casket stood at the front beneath a cross and a high window of colored glass. We had chosen a simple frame, smooth and unadorned, because she hated anything showy. A photograph of her rested on an easel beside it. She was mid-laugh, eyes half closed, head tilted just a little to the side. For a second, I felt an irrational flash of anger at the picture for being so alive. The pastor met us near the front row. He spoke my name softly, then my daughter's, and placed a hand on my shoulder with a gravity that made me straighten despite myself. His eyes were steady and kind, the kind of gaze that allows you to borrow an extra second of composure. "When you're ready," he said, and returned to the aisle. Ready felt like a word from another language. Still, we sat. The organist played a hymn I knew from childhood, and the notes moved like slow river water through the pews. People filed in, one by one, filling the spaces until the church felt like a chest holding a single breath. When the last door closed, the pastor stepped up to the lectern. He spoke of seasons, of love that doesn't end just because a body does. He told stories he had gathered from friends and family, how she kept a stash of granola bars in her purse for anyone who forgot to eat, how she wrote birthday notes months in advance so she wouldn't miss anyone, how she could make a room laugh by tilting one eyebrow and saying nothing at all. The congregation smiled in pockets, then fell quiet again, like waves pulling back from shore. I tried listening. I really did. But the center of my chest felt hollow, as if someone had harvested a vital organ and left the shape of it behind. My mind snagged on details, the tiny flick of dust spinning in a band of light, the uneven nail in the hymn board, the way my daughter's shoes didn't quite touch the floor. The pastor's voice turned into a distant bell. Then he looked directly at me. "You're not alone," he said. Just that. 3 words that cracked a line through the fog. A dozen reflexes fired at once, denial, anger, the impulse to nod politely and pretend it helped. I felt the old argument rise in me, the one I had rehearsed in the shower and in the car and in the dead silence of midnight. Alone is the place you are when the only person who could understand is gone. Alone is the bed that is too big, the laugh you reach for and can't find, the question that stays unanswered because you're the only one left to hear it. I dropped my gaze to the order of service in my lap and stared at the black print until it blurred. That was when I felt it, a small, warm hand sliding into mine. My daughter's fingers settled between my own as though they had always belonged there. She didn't look up. She didn't say a word. She just held on. Some grief is a storm that howls, some is a tide that quietly turns. This was the latter. No trumpet sounded, no light spilled from the ceiling. But something shifted in that moment, something like a hinge loosening. The pastor kept speaking, but now his words found footholds, tiny ledges where my mind could rest. I wasn't whole. I wasn't better. But I wasn't falling straight through either. When it was time for the eulogies, my brother rose first. He told the story of the night she taught him to make soup from whatever was in the pantry, how she treated creativity like a muscle you had to exercise. The room laughed when he admitted he burned the onions, the air softened when he said she stayed until the soup tasted like home. After him, her colleague read a letter from the students she had mentored, their sentences wobbly and sincere, full of thanks for the patience she had planted like seeds. I was supposed to go last. The program had my name printed beside the word remarks, which felt like a cruel joke, because what I had wasn't remarks. What I had was rubble. I stood because my daughter squeezed my hand again, once, twice. When I reached the lectern, my voice came out raw, the sound of a door opening onto cold air. "I don't have a speech," I said. "I have a memory." I paused, scanning the rows without quite seeing them. 2 months ago, we were making pancakes on a Saturday. The smoke alarm went off because I always forget the second batch. She laughed and opened the windows, and our daughter put the fan on the counter like it was an emergency tool. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the life I want, burned pancakes and easy laughter, and the three of us crowded into a kitchen that is too small when you're happy. I swallowed. I thought I would miss the big moments. What I miss most are these: how she stood on tiptoe to reach the cinnamon, how she snapped her fingers to the beat of a song I couldn't hear, how she always asked if anyone wanted the piece from the edge because it gets the crispiest. I didn't say anything about being strong. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I thanked the people who had loved her, and I returned to the pew with my knees trembling. My daughter leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stayed like that for a long time, breathing in rhythm. After the eulogies, the pastor invited anyone who wished to come forward for a final goodbye. The line formed slowly, then more quickly, like a river finding its channel. Each person paused by the casket, some touching the lid, others laying a palm flat against the smooth wood. A few whispered something private to the air. A friend slipped a folded note into the seam, another tucked a sprig of rosemary on the handle, the herbs scent bright in the heavy room. When our turn came, I didn't trust my legs, but I stood anyway. Up close, the arrangement of lilies looked almost architectural, angles and arcs, white leaning into green. I rested my fingertips on the casket and felt the coolness of the finish, the stubborn fact of it. My daughter, standing beside me, pulled the small rabbit from her pocket, the one with the worn ear, and placed it near the flowers. "For when you miss us," she whispered. Something inside me bent and didn't break. I thought of the promise my wife had asked for in the hospital: remember, you're not alone. At the time, I had mistaken it for a directive to find strength in myself. Standing there, I realized she had meant the opposite. She was asking me to accept the hands offered, to let the village she had so carefully nurtured carry us for a while. The service moved toward its close. The pastor spoke a benediction about peace that passes understanding, and for once I believed that peace might not be a feeling but a choice we make minute by minute. The organ lifted again, the congregation sang. I didn't. I listened as voices rose and braided themselves, imperfect and beautiful and enough. Outside, the sky had brightened, the rain thinning to silver threads. The pallbearers, friends who had eaten at our table more times than I could count, positioned themselves with quiet choreography. As we began the slow walk down the aisle behind the casket, I felt the room bow inward, not in pity but in solidarity. People touched the backs of the pews as we passed, a silent salute. We walked together, steady and small, but not alone at all today. After the last hymn faded and the final handshakes loosened, the church began to empty like the tide going out. The air felt different without the voices, lighter in sound but heavier in silence. My daughter and I lingered in the front pew for a moment, as if standing meant we were admitting the day was over. Eventually, I took her hand, and together we stepped outside into the pale light of late afternoon. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the pavement still glistened, reflecting the bare branches and low sky. People gathered in small clusters, coats pulled tight, voices low. They spoke in that particular funeral tone, half comfort, half uncertainty, like they were afraid to take up too much space in your grief. I thanked them, because that's what you do, but the words felt automatic, like a reflex. We got into the car and sat for a moment without starting it. My daughter stared out the window at the line of cars pulling away from the curb. She was quiet, not withdrawn, just thoughtful. "Do we go home now?" she asked finally. I nodded. "Yeah. Home." The drive was shorter than I wanted it to be. The house appeared at the end of the street the way it always did, familiar and unchanged, and yet it felt like walking into a photograph of a place I used to live. Her coat still hung on the hook by the door. The smell of lilies followed us in, clinging to our clothes from the church. On the kitchen counter, The sympathy cards had already started to pile up in neat stacks. I put the kettle on, not because I wanted tea but because the act of boiling water felt like something I could control. My daughter climbed onto the stool at the island, resting her chin in her hands. "It's too quiet," she said. She was right. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum more softly, as though it was trying not to intrude. We drank tea together in silence, the steam curling between us like a fragile thread. When we finished, I rinsed our mugs and noticed the third mug still in the sink, hers, from the morning before she went into the hospital. I left it there. That first week was a blur of casseroles and phone calls. Neighbors dropped off food we couldn't possibly eat, and relatives sent flowers so bright they almost felt defiant against the winter light. People came by to check on us, their visits short but well-meaning. My daughter seemed to understand the rhythm of these days better than I did. She would quietly set out plates when someone arrived with food, or slip upstairs when the conversations turned too heavy. One afternoon, our neighbor Mrs. Grant came over with a pot of stew. She was in her 70s, with a voice that always sounded like she'd just told a joke you hadn't heard yet. She set the pot on the counter, removed her gloves, and turned to my daughter. "Sweetheart, do you know how to make biscuits?" My daughter shook her head. "Then it's about time you learned," she said, pulling ingredients from a paper bag. I watched from the doorway as they rolled out dough together, Mrs. Grant guiding her hands, flour rising in little clouds as they pressed the cutter and counted circles on the tray. When the biscuits came out, steaming and uneven, she tapped the top of one with her fingertip and said, "See? Perfect is overrated." My daughter laughed, small, surprised, and I felt something unclench in my chest. Nights were the hardest. The house seemed bigger in the dark, every creak of the floorboards a reminder of the space beside me in bed. My daughter started asking if she could fall asleep in my room, and I didn't hesitate to say yes. Some nights she'd talk, telling me about school or asking what her mom would say about her drawings. Other nights, she'd just curl up close, and we'd listen to the steady tick of the clock until sleep came. In small ways, she kept her mother alive in the house. She'd hum the same tune her mom used to sing while cooking, or insist on making pancakes on Saturday mornings, even though she burned the first batch just like I always did. Once, I found her in the kitchen wearing her mom's apron, standing on a chair to reach the mixing bowl. She looked up at me and said, "I'm making the cinnamon rolls she liked." I didn't have the heart to tell her the recipe was complicated. We made them anyway. They came out lopsided and underbaked, but they smelled like her, and that was enough. The days stretched and folded into each other. I went back to work sooner than I probably should have, just to have somewhere to be. My coworkers were kind in that careful way people are when they don't know if mentioning the loss will hurt you or help you. Some avoided the subject entirely, others brought it up gently, like testing water with a toe. One evening, I came home late to find my daughter at the dining table, homework spread out in front of her. The lamp cast a warm glow over the room, and for the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel quite so empty. She looked up and smiled, just a small smile, but it caught me off guard. "I saved you the last piece of cake," she said, pointing to a plate covered with foil. That's when I realized something. She wasn't just surviving this with me. She was helping me survive it. That hand she'd taken at the funeral wasn't a one-time gesture. It was the quiet, daily way she kept showing up, by making pancakes, by leaving cake on the table, by leaning against me when we watched TV. Grief didn't leave. It didn't get smaller overnight. But in those weeks after the funeral, it started to take a different shape, not just a void, but a space where love kept moving, quietly but persistently. And every time my daughter reached for my hand, I heard my wife's voice again, softer now but still certain, "You're not alone." On the first Saturday without her, we went to the grocery store and wandered like tourists without a map. I paused in the baking aisle, staring at vanilla the way I once stared at her. My daughter slipped a bottle into the cart and said, "For pancakes." We bought it, as if permission to keep going could be measured by teaspoons. That night, after she fell asleep, I played a voicemail I had been avoiding. Her voice filled the dark, cheerful, ordinary, asking if we needed anything. I saved it again, not to live backward, but because the sound steadied me for one more step. A few evenings later, the clouds broke. My daughter tugged me onto the porch to look at stars. Mom said the brightest ones are stubborn, she whispered. We stayed until our hands went numb, and when we went inside, the house didn't echo as much. On the fridge, a note from Mrs. Grant invited us to a support group at the community center. I didn't call. I left it there, a reminder. Grief, I've learned, doesn't follow a straight line. It isn't a staircase where each day takes you higher, closer to better. It's more like the tide. Sometimes it pulls back so you can see the sand again, and sometimes it surges forward and knocks you off your feet when you weren't even looking at the water. In the weeks after the funeral, I found myself measuring time in strange ways. There were before things and after things. Before, the sound of the front door opening meant she was home. After, it meant the wind had caught it, or my daughter had just come back from school. Before, I could walk past the bakery without feeling a weight in my chest. After, even the smell of cinnamon made my eyes sting. But slowly, so slowly I didn't notice at first, something began to change. It wasn't that the grief got smaller. It was that life began to grow around it, the way grass pushes up through cracks in the sidewalk. One Saturday morning, my daughter woke me before the sun was up. She was wearing her mother's apron again, the ties doubled around her waist, and she had flour on her cheek. We're making pancakes, she announced. I started to tell her it was too early, but then I saw the grin on her face, mischievous, proud, a little like her mom's when she was planning something, and I got up. We worked in the kitchen together, the radio playing quietly in the background. She mixed while I flipped. The first batch burned, as always, and we laughed, stacking them on a plate anyway. We sat at the table in the quiet morning light, syrup dripping off the edges of our plates, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to contentment. Not joy, exactly. But a reminder that joy wasn't gone forever. That night, after she went to bed, I pulled out the box of keepsakes I'd been avoiding. Inside were letters she'd written me over the years, ticket stubs from concerts, the menu from the tiny Italian restaurant where we had our first anniversary dinner. At the very bottom was a folded piece of paper in her handwriting, "You're not alone." No context, no signature. Just those 3 words. I didn't remember when she'd written it. But I knew why she had. The more I thought about it, the more I realized those words weren't just for the funeral, or the hospital, or the worst days. They were instructions for the rest of my life. They meant accepting help when it's offered. They meant recognizing the people who stand beside you when you can't stand on your own. And they meant remembering that love doesn't end just because a heartbeat does. Spring came in fits and starts, the way it always does here, warm one day, frost the next. My daughter and I planted a small garden in the backyard. It wasn't anything elaborate, just a few herbs and flowers she picked out herself. She knelt in the dirt, her hair falling into her face, and told me she was planting happy things. We watched the first shoots break through the soil together, and I thought about how much my wife would have loved that moment. I started to notice the ways my daughter was carrying her mother forward without even realizing it. The way she greeted strangers with a smile. The way she paid attention when someone was quiet, asking them a question to draw them out. The way she left sticky notes on my desk that said things like, "Have a good day" or "Don't forget lunch." One evening, we were cleaning up after dinner when she asked me if I thought Mom could see us. I paused, drying my hands on a towel. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I like to think she can." My daughter nodded, satisfied with that answer, and said, "Then I think she knows we're okay." And we were. Not all the time. Not in the way we were before. But in a new way that made space for both the love we had lost and the love we still had. Months later, I went back to the church for the first time since the funeral. It was for a community event, not a service, but when I walked in, the sound of the rain on the windows came back to me. I saw the pew where we'd sat, the aisle where we'd walked behind the casket, and I remembered the moment my daughter's hand slid into mine. I could still feel it, the warmth, the steadiness, the unspoken promise. I realized then that the pastor's words had been true, even if I hadn't wanted to believe them. I wasn't alone. I never had been. Not in that church. Not in the house that still smelled faintly of cinnamon. Not in the mornings when pancakes burned and laughter found its way back into the kitchen. A few weeks after that, my daughter and I were walking home from the park when she reached for my hand. It was warm outside, no reason for the gesture except that she wanted to. I glanced down at her, and she smiled, a small, knowing smile that made her look older than her years. I squeezed her hand twice, and she squeezed back. Our code for I love you, still intact. In that moment, I realized that the thread tying the past to the present wasn't just memory. It was action. It was choosing, every day, to keep loving in the face of loss. Grief will always be part of my life. But so will the love that came before it. And maybe that's the point, that the two can exist together, not canceling each other out, but shaping each other into something stronger. So if you're listening to this and you've lost someone you love, I want you to hear me, you're not alone. Even when it feels like the world has closed its doors. Even when the nights are too quiet and the mornings too long. There are still hands waiting to hold yours, still voices ready to speak your name, still reasons to keep stepping forward. Because love doesn't leave. It changes shape, it moves differently, but it stays. And if you let it, it will carry you. Thank you for being here, for sharing this time with me, and for letting my story into your day. If this touched you in any way, please subscribe and like this video, because sometimes, even on the internet, a simple connection can remind someone they're not alone. And if you're comfortable, share your own story in the comments. You never know who might read it and realize, for the first time in a long time, that they're not alone either.